So, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to the 530 people who signed up for today's conversation. Will we end up breaking Zoom? Stay tuned and we'll find out in just a bit. And for those of you don't know and just clicked on the link, today's event is part of a series of conversations to celebrate 50 years of CPR, and specifically to look back on its work on climate and energy and environment that we've learned so much from, and to look ahead at this critical decade for India and the world. While we wait for more of you all to trickle in, I'd like to introduce you to our incredible panel that really needs no introduction if you've been in this space even for a little bit. So these are scholars, teachers, thinkers, lawyers who've been at the forefront of the climate conversation when the subject was still niche and not the everyday is doomsday timeline that it is now. So we have Professor Navroz Dubash, who's the anchor at CPR's Initiative on Climate, Energy and Environment, also known as IC. Navroz was the coordinating IPCC lead author on the sixth assessment and had a major hand in bringing together what we now know as Climate Action Network way back in 1990. Next up, we have Radhika Khosla, who I know from the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development and the Smith School, but who has been doing so much of the thinking on cities, energy consumption, and climate, and who's been working on the future of cooling way before there was a Ministry for the Future. We have Dr. Lavanya Rajamani, who is a professor of international environmental law at the University of Oxford, also an IPCC lead author on the sixth assessment, and part of the co-drafting team at the 2015 Paris negotiations. Lavanya wrote an award-winning book on international environmental law that I'm guilty of oversighting in my master's thesis, and so many others. Finally, we have Shibani Ghosh, a Supreme Court lawyer and scholar, who I know from her tremendous research, from her cases, her work on climate and environmental litigation in India, and also for digging into things like pollution control boards. So that's a huge, huge blind spot that we have both probed and have in common. And I'm so grateful for everybody's research that we've learned so much from. And I'm Aruna Chandrasekhar, your host today. I'm a climate journalist at Carbon Brief. So yeah, between our panelists today, you called the Paris Agreement and its ratchet mechanism before it even happened. And you literally wrote the handbook, two of them even, on climate change and India and international law. You gave the Panchamrit a plan advising the Indian government on its long-term low emission strategy. And we are now at this crucial inflection point in climate politics, both globally, but also in India. At home, we're still reeling from a late below normal monsoon that wreaked widespread damage when coupled with development choices that have failed to factor in climate change. Rescue efforts are still ongoing in Sikkim, where communities and experts debate India's hydropower rush as our key non-fossil energy backbone. On a global scale, we're seeing warming trends that climate scientists themselves are calling, quote unquote, absolutely gobsmackingly bananas. Geopolitical tensions and protectionism is rife. Got green trade wars as blocs prioritize energy security, jobs, and shoring up their own supplies, whether that's good old oil and gas or critical minerals. And at this point, we're going into an already controversial COP that aims to provide an honest report card of how countries are doing collectively since Paris, a process known as the global stocktake. But it's alarmingly clear that there's a huge gap between pledges, what the science calls for, and money on the table as damages grow each day. Despite the rallying calls of 1.5 to stay alive, it seems clear that we will overshoot this. We're already there. And getting back to 1.5 will depend on what we do now and in the coming decades. So, Navroz, do we need more or better pledges, or should we be focusing on implementing actions that work best, since our current approach seems to be everything, everywhere, all at once?
Well, thank you, Aruna. Thank you for agreeing to chair this discussion. I have to start by saying how absolutely delightful it is to be back on a screen with my colleagues Lavanya, Radhika, and Shibani. We've spent many happy years at CPR in the past. Lots of arguments and discussions, most of them productive, some of them just plain cussed, but that's okay. And so this is just a really fun event that at least I've been looking forward to. So to try and address your pretty big question, Aruna, I think we are going into this COP at a time when it's becoming really clear that we are going to overshoot 1.5 degrees as a global community. And whether we get back to 1.5 depends on what happens in the next couple of decades. And so the construct that the Paris Agreement is thought to be built around, and substantially is built around, this idea of an ambition cycle where countries put on the table their pledges. We see if it adds up to what is required by science. Everybody goes back and ups it every 5 years, and we are at that upping moment next year. That process doesn't seem to be moving us as fast and as far as we thought, right? So the COP is going to have to grapple with this. But I at least feel that one of the reasons is that we're kind of misunderstanding the real motive power of the Paris Agreement. So this naming and shaming kind of story doesn't work that well when you've had leaders in the past like Trump and Morrison and so on and so forth. And in fact, it can be kind of a reputational, people don't mind the reputational drag. Countries don't mind the reputational drag. And this can turn into kind of a vicious cycle. But if you view the Paris Agreement as slightly different, and Lavanya has written about this in her book, that it is, the heft in the Paris Agreement is its procedural requirements. And the procedures requiring you to do an NDC every 5 years, do long-term strategies, report periodically, and so on and so forth, those things exercise kind of a churn at the domestic level. And what I think has been really productive is we've seen that churning leading to countries rethinking their domestic politics around climate change. Suddenly, many countries, and India included, want to be on the forefront of new technologies. They want to be leaders in solar panels and solar panel manufacturing. They want to get ahead of the green hydrogen curve. And that kind of dynamic tells an opportunity story around climate rather than the idea of it being entirely a division of costs. So I think when you look at the COP that way, or the COP process, the UNFCCC process that way, that's the way in which we should benchmarking the success of these COPs. And I've just written an article about this that I'll ask Sonali to kind of plug in the chat. And if we look at it that way, then actually the COPs become an interesting place to understand whether they're spurring national governments and shifting national politics in the direction of low carbon futures. And of course, they're important not just for that, but because that's the place where we add up what countries do. That's the place where we see whether equity is met. That's where loss and damage is taken forward, and so on. So the international process is really important, but I think the driving power is when it unlocks national politics and national processes. So that's how I'm kind of reading this COP in very broad brush terms.
Thanks, Navroz. And kind of refocusing again, of course, that the international process can be a driver. There's also lots to look back on and how far we've come since the Paris Agreement. Lavanya, what do you think we can expect from the global stocktake and its outcome at the COP? And lessons that can be learned, and what sort of an outcome will that shape? Is that going to put more pressure on countries to up their pledges, or, as Navroz says, each country to their own? And a second follow-up question to that is a completely different one, which is, how do you see the fights for over 1.5 and loss and damage playing out, and what they mean for countries like India, especially given the brackets around particularly vulnerable and vulnerability and who should pay? And especially when this has sort of been invoked in the past before to sort of drive more ambition in emerging economies or to get them to pay.
Thank you, Aruna. And let me just start by saying I sort of very much share Navroz's enthusiasm for this panel discussion and to be in a sort of, albeit virtual, forum with these wonderful colleagues that we worked with for so many years, and to sort of replicate some of the conversations and debates that we've had over the years, to do that, to have an opportunity to do that today. So in relation to the questions that you asked, Aruna, this global stocktake is in many ways the most consequential one, because it's coming in the middle of the critical decade up to 2030. And it's also going to provide us a template for future global stocktake. So it is in many ways a very consequential and perhaps the most consequential one. But for all of that, I think the actual outcome that we're likely to see in the COP is not likely to tell us something we don't know, in a sense, that we're not on track. There are gaps in implementation, ambition, fairness, and accountability. And these have all been documented very well in the synthesis report of the technical dialogue that came out last month. I think what we might see, and which would be helpful, is that as ways of actually plugging those gaps to how do we get back on track. So yes, there are gaps, but how do we actually get back on track? And I think there will be a focus, much more of a focus, I hope, on implementation rather than actually just target setting and ramping up sort of pressure on states to set new targets. There will be an emphasis, I think, on scaling up renewable energy. There is talk of tripling the world's renewable energy capacity while phasing out all unabated fossil fuels. And this is one of the key findings of the technical dialogue. And of course, also scale up finance. There will probably need to be some sort of strong outcome on finance and support for countries to actually be able to do these things. And finally, I think to enhance also accountability across states and non-state actors. I hope that the outcome will also have some sort of robust follow-up process through 2024. And to the early part of 2025, because part of the motivation for the global stocktake is to actually inform the next set of NDCs. So whatever outcomes and signals there are from the global stocktake at the end of the year, there should be some follow-up process that actually maps those on to see whether they're actually going to deliver on those. Because we've had several COPs in the past which have had sort of global commitments which are not actually followed up on. I think in terms of big takeaways from the global stocktake process thus far, I think there is sort of a shift in the framing with respect to a few things. First, I think, in line, I think to some extent with what Navroz was saying earlier, instead of actually focusing on target setting, the focus is shifting very subtly. I think there is a pivot towards focusing on implementation and understanding that implementation triggers iteratively increasing ambition. And it's not just target setting, because sort of ramping up pressure on states to just set targets after targets is actually building a house of cards. I think the second shift, in a sense, is that equity and fairness is being reframed, both in terms of systems transitions domestically and between states, as something that actually fosters ambition rather than something that detracts from ambition. And I think that's a very positive move if we actually sort of actualize it in the course of the outcome of the stocktake, the political part of the stocktake. And finally, I think in terms of big takeaways from the global stocktake process so far, we're not actually going to get where we need to get without this engaging with a wider landscape of action and actors, and of course, engaging with this idea of the global stocktake and the Paris Agreement regime more broadly as triggering and catalyzing domestic policy shifts towards the transformations that we need, again, to complement what Navroz was saying earlier. So I think there are some big takeaways, hopefully, from the global stocktake thus far, the technical part of it, and I hope this will translate into effective political signals as well at COP28. And the second part of your question, Aruna, about 1.5. I think there are a couple of different fights over 1.5, right? So one of the fights is the ones that we've sort of already alluded to, the extent to which the 1.5 degree target should be used to sort of pressure countries like India to do more. And I think on this, the emphasis on target setting is problematic, as I've already said. It is, we are building a house of cards if we just kind of ramp up targets without any consideration of how these are actually going to be implemented and providing enabling conditions to implement them. I think the second fight is over actually acknowledging that there will be an overshoot and adapting to it. And I think that's something, there is resistance in the negotiations to that because, many vulnerable countries think that if we actually acknowledge in official processes that there is going to be an overshoot, that actually signals giving up on 1.5. And while I have some sympathy with that view, I think not acknowledging the inevitable leaves us very, very underprepared to actually address it effectively. And that's actually, I think, the real challenge in relation to addressing loss and damage. It's not just loss and damage today, it's loss and damage in an overshoot scenario. And that is not something we're actually addressing very in a holistic fashion yet. Are the funding arrangements and the loss and damage fund that is meant to be operationalized at COP28 the answer? I would suggest not. I think there isn't a common understanding yet, despite sort of several workshops of the transitional committee. There isn't a common understanding of who benefits, who pays, and where the money is coming from. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board and think far more holistically about how we manage loss and damage in an overshoot world. So I'm going to leave it there, of course, but I'm happy to come back on any of these issues. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Lavanya. I think that was a really, really good overview of the state of play and what is getting picked up on and what isn't. And also the fact that, I mean, the GST will also be having an overview of finance, and we're also going to be talking, on one hand, we're talking about targets and ambition in terms of missions, but what are we going to be talking about in terms of a new quantitative goal on finance, or on adaptation finance if we overshoot, or on that quantum of well, misplaced trust, which is growing every single year. So we are in a situation where that carbon budget is rapidly shrinking. We've got North-South trust that is weak, even though it seems to be the year in which the 100 billion might actually come true, who knows? But those seem to be the noises as well. But those side ties are worsening in the geopolitical domain. But there's also an energy transformation that's underway. And Navroz, where does India currently stand, and how should it respond to the rapidly changing global energy landscape? And also, Radhika, if you'd like to pick up on this one.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a quick word and then hand it over to Radhika and come back in, and maybe I'll talk a little bit more about how I see this playing out in India. So I just want to pick up where Lavanya left off on the increased attention to implementation. And I completely agree with that. And what happens there, if you do focus on implementation, over time, you get interests, economic interests that are tied to low carbon futures who get more of a foothold in political processes. And so it becomes a fulfilling kind of cycle. And that's what we've started seeing in India a little bit, right? Where even large fossil interests are beginning to hedge their bets and think about investing in renewables, right? And I think India has sort of seen this story about a competitive economy being tied to being ahead of the curve on some of these new technologies. Now, whether or not we'll be able to achieve that is tied to questions like, can India do green industrial policy? Can we get access to the investment capital required to do so? But there's another angle to it that I just want to briefly bring up, and then I'm going to pause and hand over to Radhika and maybe come back. These are sort of positive signs broadly that India is thinking about a green transition, but we seem to be doing it in ways that are really tied to relatively large capital getting into this game. And so we've seen, for example, that renewable energy, large-scale renewable energy is taking off, but the rooftop renewable energy and the decentralized renewable energy much less so, right? Some of the new technologies like hydrogen are highly capital intensive. So is the EV industry and the battery industry. The question this leads me to ask is, I think we might be moving in a direction that's green. Are we moving in a direction that's green and equitable at the same time, where the benefits are spread throughout society? I'm a little less sure. And I think we all have to keep our eye on this and make sure that we have a green transition in India that's also equitable. But I think we'll work this out in the course of thinking through implementation issues. And I think what I would love to see coming out of the stock take is not just calls for more ambition by 2035, which we should have absolutely, but actually for countries to, why not just aim to over-comply your 2030 pledges? If you can, there's still several years. Let's try and all over-comply and put ourselves in a better place leading into 2030. So those are sort of the two themes, that we want green, but also equitable at the national level, and globally, maybe we can think more in terms of implementation and over-compliance rather than building these houses of cards, as Lavanya was saying. Radhika, what do you think?
Thanks, Navroz. And I will also take a moment to say how wonderful it is to be here. And our time together in CPR was so special and generative. And any opportunity to be back together is always welcome. So thank you for having us here together. So Aruna, you had asked about the global energy transition, and Navroz spoke a little bit about India. Maybe I will come back to sort of, the global piece, and then we can locate India within it. So there are sort of three things that I think are really important in terms of how we're transitioning and thinking about these issues globally. The first is that we've just seen a global energy crisis sparked by the war in Ukraine, and what we had last year were the highest or extremely high coal and natural gas prices in 2022, and the repercussions of that are still being borne out, particularly by those that are most vulnerable. In many advanced countries and developed economies, governments have spent over 500 billion just to protect and shield consumers. And it has led to this sort of moment where there's a real question about whether this could be the pivot to a cleaner and a more secure energy system. And a lot of countries are rethinking and asking that question as a result of that sort of political moment. Now, I think on the supply side, what has been a really interesting finding that has come about, and it's some of the work that came out of Oxford, is that when we look at inflation-adjusted useful energy costs over 150 years, and you look at fossil fuel sources and non-fossil fuel sources. So basically, when we look at energy supply sources broadly, coal, oil, and gas, they follow a flat line. Whereas when we look at new technologies such as solar, wind, batteries, their prices have really, really plummeted. And so the trend that these sort of newer, cleaner technologies are showing us is completely different to what we have seen for over 150 years when we normalize costs and deployment rates. And that is actually really promising, because what it means is that when we can have net savings on costs, but also these new technologies that are much more modular, much more small scale, and driven by policy support in many countries, have the power to transition much more quickly than our models even told us they would. So when we compare actual rates to modeling rates, the reality looks better, which is, we don't see that as often, especially in climate change issues. The third thing I'll say is on the demand side, and there's more and more evidence now of how powerful the demand side is in enabling this energy transition to both be equitable and be clean. And the IPCC numbers are that 40 to 70% of mitigation potential for the energy system lies on the demand side. And that's an extremely high number. If you can have 40 to 70% mitigation potential on the demand side just through transportation, food, the built environment, and industry, you can go very, very far in moving towards those kinds of goals. And globally, of course, and this is different to the Indian context in some sense, but globally, the two most important things we need on the demand side are electrification of transportation and electrification of heating. That is kind of where a lot of the low-hanging fruit lies, and the heating issue, of course, is less relevant in India. Now, what does this all mean in the Indian context? And I will turn it back to Navroz for this, but essentially we're grappling with some of these trends where we're seeing the prices of non-fossil fuel, solar, wind really plummet and see dramatic improvements over the last few years. But we also have these targets of sort of 50% fossil fuel free energy systems, and at that point, and 500 gigawatts, of fossil fuel free energy systems by 2030. But at that point, 50% will still be coal-based, right, in terms of generation. So we still have both of these kind of these issues where we have a lot of coal in the system and a lot of growth in renewables. But linking it back to the global context, I think the issues that we're struggling with are sort of the same globally, which is how do we manage storage? How do we manage peak demand management? What do we do with intermittency? Because that's when an integrated system will work. And there are local realities of the political economy, of utilities, and the grid really bring out a different story. So that's probably a good point to turn it back to Navroz too, who can tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Radhika. I think certainly agree with everything you've said. I wanted to pick up on the demand and re-emphasize the importance of that side of things. And I think what's the way I think about it, and the way I think we don't think about it enough globally, is that in the developing world, most of what we are trying to do is avoid locking into a high carbon future. We're not in most countries at the point where we've peaked and are reducing emissions. But there's a big difference between steeply increasing emissions and then trying to reduce them, or increasing them at a more shallow level and bringing forward the date of peaking. In other words, is your trajectory looking like a mountain? Is your trajectory looking like a hill, right? And if you can actually make it look like a hill instead of a mountain, you have avoided a big share of emissions. And that's actually a massive contribution. And too often in sort of IPCC conversations and other conversations, that gets ignored, right? The fact that you're actually avoiding locking into high carbon futures. And what's also very important about this is that the way you avoid it is, of course, through demand side measures, right? Much of what you're doing is building your cities differently, building your infrastructure and your buildings differently, building your freight corridors differently. So these are things that actually the kinds of policy levers many people talk about, carbon taxes and cap and trade and so on, won't actually help you with this. You need a different set of levers. And so there's a whole different kind of economics and public policy around policies to avoid emissions that are very central to the developing world and that we haven't perhaps spent enough time on. The second thing I'll say, bring it back to India in particular, is that, and I think this is true of other developing countries, we often have policies in India that actually take us further than our international pledges, right? We actually are on track to overcomply. So even while we're looking at 500 odd gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity, we actually have a domestic policy. It's actually in the Indian regulatory structure to have 43% of our electricity from non-fossil fuel sources in terms of generation, not capacity. And that's really important, because if you ramp up capacity without talking about generation, a lot of that capacity might remain idle. But actually, when you say you have a renewable performance obligation of 43%, you actually have to meet 43% of your electricity needs from non-fossil fuel sources. So in some ways, it's a much more challenging target, because you've got to make your grid work that way. You've got to figure out the balance between coal and renewables to get to that 43% number. So what we're seeing is actually interesting below the surface efforts to push the Indian economy further, in fact, than where the international pledge will take us, which I think is intriguing, and again speaks to that earlier conversation we had about implementation as a perhaps a more fruitful conversation than only talking about ambition. Obviously, you need both, but I think we have to focus a bit more on implementation than we have been doing.
I think that's a really, really important point, and a good time to also to transition to a conversation around what is domestic law, what are those protections. But first, I'd like, if for those watching, please leave your questions in the Q&A box, and we'd be happy to pick them up. We're going to aim to have at least 30 minutes. Try our best, because this is a fascinating conversation. But yeah, we're going to aim to have 30 minutes of question and answer. So leave your chat in there, your questions in there, and we'll pick them up soon after. But yeah, it brings this conversation to an interesting turning point, where we also look at regulation, institutions, and domestic law versus international law. Shivani, given the limits of top-down international law, there is an increasing reliance on bottom-up national pledges and on domestic law. But how is this likely to work for countries like India, where on one hand, you do have progressive policies and things that have been spelled out, as Navroz said, that also have teeth. But at the same time, you have environmental governance that is poor, laws that are being steadily eroded in environmental protection. And in that area, the legal wins are few and far-paced, and access to justice has been limited. We've been seeing, Green Tribunal, the different benches being shut down because there are not that many experts. We have communities who are, trying to enforce some of these standards or trying to fight for their rights, but who are seeing their access to justice also being limited. But where do you see domestic law sort of coming through?
Well, thank you so much, Aruna. Just want to echo how excited I am to be on this panel, but also I'm just looking at the list of participants. So many of our friends and former colleagues who've joined in. Thank you so much. I wish we were all back in the conference room at CPR where we've had many such conversations, but it's really nice of you all to kind of, be part of this discussion with us. But yeah, so Aruna, about coming back to your question about where we are on domestic regulation and governance in the Indian context. First of all, let me answer this question at two levels in terms of domestic law, and then domestic courts, because the judicial system, we often kind of mix up the two in terms of law being litigation or the courts, and it's not. And so much of the writing about from international law and then how Indian law is kind of responding to that is about how our parliamentarians, the legislature, and how the executive is responding to the demand of climate commitments or the need of the hour, as it were. And then there's this whole set of issues on how are the courts responding to that, which is very different and equal and important in a sense. So let me begin by looking at as you referred to, kind of the regulatory failure or poor governance. And there, of course, countries like India are really at a disadvantage, because if some of this response to climate change, the response to the impact of climate change has to be from subnational actors or initiated by national actors, our institutions and our governance, the framework, doesn't make us very optimistic. And it has failed at multiple levels for multiple reasons over decades to even respond to smaller scale environmental issues. And those systemic problems remain. Systemic kind of the reasons of why those and you kind of refer to our pollution control board work, which is kind of referring to institutional failures and why that has occurred. And there's so many reasons of that, why that has occurred. So I feel the manner in which our environmental regulatory framework has not functioned or has failed would also affect the manner in which we propose solutions to the climate impacts or propose our kind of response to climate impacts. And therefore, that makes me pessimistic. But at the same time, I realize that there are limits to international, the global framework. There are limits to which a top-down approach can have effect. And at the end of the day, even if you had a top-down approach, the implementation, as we're all talking, has to be through, at the end of the day, that poor state pollution control board executive engineer is going to go and do something. He has no idea what this greenhouse gas emission, no idea what Paris Agreement is. But, he's the chap who's going to have to go and implement it. And that's currently the institutional framework we are going to rely on. If we come up with some, if we come up with something completely new, a whole kind of, a whole new slate to come up with, which is looking unlikely, then, that's where we are. And you also but at the same time, and maybe we can come back to this later on, in terms of what the legal framework provides as solutions, where are the hooks if we were to respond through legal mechanisms to the climate impact? As we know, India doesn't have a climate law, doesn't have a climate legislation, but many of us have been working on this, colleagues in CPR and outside, about what the hooks are and what the argument for coming up with a new law is. So there is a lot of conversation, and I think that's important, because without the legal backing, it'll be very hard to bring in some kind of climate regulation. The second set of issues, which is on climate litigation, Aruna, I think the Indian courts make me optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. Optimistic because, many of us know how our courts have been accused and praised at the same time of being judicially active or adventurous or whatever it were. So yeah, they can just pull things out of thin air, and Lavanya has written so much about it, about international environmental law suddenly and surprisingly becoming part of our domestic law, and no one really knows what's happening, but the courts just think it's great and let's just do it. And also just in terms of how liberally and kind of flexibility that our Indian courts have found in the Indian law to bring in international environmental law, and therefore that could be extended to climate law in some senses. So there is some optimism. Also, just how access to justice in terms of who can approach the courts is much wider, our constitutional rights, our statutory rights, all of which can be interpreted very liberally to allow a lot of climate litigation potentially in the country. But it makes me pessimistic because at the end of the day, it's the Indian judiciary. It's the same Indian judiciary which has a massive overflowing docket on many issues. It's the same Indian judiciary which is unpredictably reluctant to enter policy measures. And most of climate-related issues are economic policy-related issues the judiciary may or may not want to enter. So therefore, there is that kind of, you don't know where the Indian courts will kind of come down on when we are talking about climate litigation and climate law. But at the same time, there's this, and I'll end with that, there is this new kind of trend of talking on environmental rule of law, which the current Chief Justice of India, Justice Chandrachud, has been talking about, where he is trying to move more towards better accountability, better systems, better institutions, improved governance as kind of the backbone of rule of law. And right now it's in his judgments. At some point, if it flows into our regulation and kind of gets implemented in some way or form, I think that's kind of the way would be a positive way to go towards. Perhaps Lavanya would like to pick.
Yeah, I share many of, thanks so much for that also, Shibani, sharing many of those both up and down, the frustrations as well as the pessimism, but also some of the realism and seeing what those challenges are. It's two guys on a motorbike trying to look at, 12 thermal power plants and whether norms have been followed or not, and the pressure of sort of doing that, and the immense challenges of communities having to video conference with judges and being pitted against big lawyers, and at the same time regulators siding with polluters but occasionally coming through with great judgments, and it's this sort of a thing that kind of can frustrate communities, and which is also leading to globally a number of climate litigation cases growing significantly. And many have challenged government decisions based on Paris Agreement goals. And this is not just in developed countries, but also it's some in developing countries as well. There are countries' net zero commitments and what projects are being proposed. And we've also seen like this growing body of human rights and environmental law associated with climate change growing, whether that's the right to healthy environment, whether that's the advisory opinion that's been sought on climate change by Vanuatu as well as Pacific Youth. Lavanya, do you see international climate law and environmental law gaining more teeth to be a sufficient deterrent against climate inaction by countries as well as big polluters? It's a big question, but yeah.
Thanks, Aruna. Before I address that big question, I also wanted to sort of pick up on something Shibani raised in relation to domestic climate litigation in India. And I think while I very much share her thoughts on, both the optimism and the pessimism with respect to the ability of the Indian courts to actually deal with this effectively, I do think there is some scope for the Indian courts to intervene, especially in relation to adaptation. I think in relation to mitigation, there are lots of sort of challenges, not least the sort of the global blame game, right? So, and to the extent to which Indian courts want to get into that, should India mitigate more, especially in the context of a global collective action problem, which many others are sort of also not doing as much as they should in relation to their fair share. So I think the Indian courts might be reluctant to step into that quagmire. But I think in relation to adaptation, in relation to sort of the rights, protected rights under the Constitution, and there's an extensive array of them, both, within the Constitution, but even sort of through interpretation, I think there are ways in which rights are being compromised. Fundamental rights are being compromised through climate impacts. And by inaction on adaptation and developing resilience to the climate impacts that we all know are here and are going to increasingly escalate. So can we actually hold the state accountable through litigation, hold the state accountable for doing more to actually help us adapt to the impacts of climate change? And I think that also sort of twins quite nicely with our own development agenda in terms of building resilience, sustainable development agenda. So I think there are some useful complementarities there that the Indian courts could actually explore, and they have the ability to do it because of all the sort of hooks they've created for themselves, the courts, in terms of actually addressing issues that they choose to address, and the discretion they've arrogated to themselves to be able to do so. So as Shivani pointed out. On international climate change law and environmental law gaining more teeth, I think there are tweaks possible to the existing UN climate regime that will make it more effective and robust than it currently is. There's certainly some scope for that, but it's very unlikely to gain teeth, as it were. It's not going to turn from the big fluffy bunny rabbit it is into a tiger, so it's not going to do that. But I think there is scope for climate litigation that is in the pipeline to actually clarify and strengthen legal obligations relating to climate change. You mentioned in your remarks at some point the International Court of Justice has been asked for an advisory opinion, and I think there are actually 3 advisory opinions in the pipeline, one of which has already held its hearings, the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, looking at the marine impacts. In particular, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, which has already sort of, pronounced quite progressively on the interlinkages between environmental law and human rights, and especially in relation to extraterritorial obligations in relation to human rights and climate impacts. But I think now the International Court of Justice and the unique sort of element, and I think this will hopefully be the most consequential of them. The unique element here is that actually the advisory opinion is being sought by the International Court from the International Court of Justice through a General Assembly resolution that was adopted by consensus, and it had 132 co-sponsoring states. So this is a sort of a huge step, even in terms of states acknowledging that they need clarification on legal rights and responsibilities that they bear in relation to climate harms that they might sort of unleash on vulnerable nations and people. And I'm hopeful that this advisory opinion will actually take the sort of legal obligation and framework forward in at least 2 or 3 respects. First, that the Paris Agreement is not the only relevant regime. And I think that's an important step forward, because the Paris Agreement, since it is a consensus-based sort of outcome, and it is located, and I've said this several times, in the sort of very narrow sweet spot between the red lines of parties. So it has very clear limits. Although it's doing relatively well in some respects, it has very clear limits and gaps, which this global stocktake will actually highlight. So first, the Paris Agreement is not the only relevant regime, that there are interlocking obligations between customs and treaties, and also across a range of treaties, including especially human rights, on which there have been huge advances recently. And finally, that this set of obligations actually requires a high degree of due diligence from states in relation to climate harms. At the ambitious end of the spectrum, I'm actually hopeful that the ICJ will identify concrete indicators that determine a standard of due diligence to be expected from states in relation to climate harms. So I think there is some scope for strengthening international climate change law, limited scope within the UN climate regime, much more scope for the larger framework to be bolstered through sort of international judicial pronouncements. Thanks.
Thanks, Lavanya. Really looking forward to what happens in that space. But yeah, I think zooming out from the international law space and from the COP space, I wanted to kind of...
Sorry, Aruda, can I just jump in and ask Lavanya a quick follow-up question on this, if that's okay? Just mix it up a bit. Okay. So that was a fascinating angle coming from the international law side, Lavanya. But I'm very curious. I could clearly see, and I think you used the phrase, standards of due diligence in terms of preparedness and adaptation. I can really see that kind of driving a lot on the adaptation side. Do you see it having the same degree of force on the mitigation side, where domestic politics seems to be kind of the limiting factor? We've seen the UK with this, proclaiming for a decade it's the most ambitious story out there. It's got all these institutions, and yet there's a real kind of wobble going on at the moment. So I'm curious if you see it having a different pathway of impact for mitigation versus adaptation.
Thanks, Navroz. That's a sort of really interesting and interesting angle to this, I think, whether there's a distinction in mitigation and adaptation. I should say on the UK, though, that the wobbles are not just on climate. There are lots of wobbles going on politically. But having said that, I think on mitigation versus adaptation, I think the due diligence standard that we've been talking about in international law actually has been framed primarily in the context of mitigation and the impacts that acts of states that cause transboundary harm is going to have on vulnerable nations and communities, and what sort of responsibilities nations have in relation to that. But it can work as effectively in relation to due diligence standards for adaptation within the domestic context. So due diligence absolutely is due diligence not just in relation to mitigation and transboundary harms, but is also in relation to adapting to impacts domestically. So I think it can have it will take a different shape in relation to adaptation, because it'll be far more sort of focused on domestic rather than international.
Yeah.
But impacts, but it will. But we are hoping that it'll have some very concrete outcomes in relation to sort of mitigation and transboundary harm as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Lavanya. And also speaking of mitigation and adaptation in domestic context, winter is coming, Diwali is coming. We are about to enter peak smog season again. And one of the arguments that Navroz and CPR has advanced is on, they say keep calm and co-benefits. But one of the co-benefits of acting on climate, there are many, including cleaner skies, lungs, lower power bills, fewer Lancet reports. How has the institutional response and narrative around air pollution in India evolved? And do you think that air pollution, which was a sort of gateway drug for getting urban Indians to start thinking about emissions, health, transport, and agriculture, and doing the right thing on mitigation, and has it now taken a backseat to the climate change conversation? Or do you think that the air pollution framework serves as a model for getting actors, that is state, center, various different polluters on the same page? Shivani.
Right. Yes, we are going to enter the season, as it were, but as many of us working in this space have been trying to spread the message that it's actually the whole year, the whole country, we're just in terms of exposure, significant majority of this country, whether living in rural, urban, or peri-urban areas, are exposed to air quality, which is just skyrocketing. I mean, off our national ambient air quality standards, which we already know are, more lenient than the WHO standards. So yes, I think the season is upon us because we can see it. We don't realize it the rest of the year. But in terms of the change, if there has been a shift in policy, if the policies have evolved, Aruna, I think one thing we can definitely say is that it is on the mind of policymakers. It's something that they are thinking. I'm not necessarily saying that they're coming up with effective policies that are being implemented well, but 5 years ago or 7 years ago, when at CPR we started talking about air quality, it was a relatively new issue for people to get around and talk about, even in cities. And now with the NCAP coming in 2019 and more city action plans being drafted, there is kind of at the city level, state level, national level, at least some momentum to talk about air quality, which wasn't there. It is definitely an incremental move, and move which is not at all proportionate to the scale and nature of the the scale and nature of this national emergency that we are facing. But it's evolving and it's there. The second thing I'd like to say is that there is a need to move out of cities and a conversation outside the urban pollution, which hasn't happened. It needs to happen, and it's not happening because, I mean, if you just look at the basic numbers of monitors and where they're set up, if you just start counting monitors, we don't have monitors in most part of the country outside the cities. Even in cities which are polluted, we have one or two. I mean, it's only Delhi because it's Delhi, which probably has like 38, 40, whatever it were. But
and all the foreign correspondents in the world.
And also all and the Supreme Court of India and the Delhi High Court and EPCA, formerly EPCA, now CAQM. And, that's why we have 38 or 40 monitors, Aruna. And you have traveled, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and that whole belt, and you could speak for how many monitors there were there and how many were functional. Yeah, right. So, I mean, we need to move that conversation as well. Yes, a lot of us have said that, there's enough data out there to start moving. I mean, that's something we'll still continue to say, that there's enough data out there for us to come up with policy measures, strengthen our institutional response. But at the same time, it seems like our institutional response is almost blinkered to look at the cities and come up with city action plans. And unfortunately, the EdCap kind of pushes that forward. The whole point of looking at the airshed or looking at regional air quality is something that needs to take root. The NCAP refers to that kind of briefly, but I think there is, I mean, you talked about the season, now the whole Indo-Gangetic Plain starting from October, November, Diwali, the crop burning, all of that. Indo-Gangetic Plain is the one region that we talk about most, but clearly there are other parts of the country which on a regional scale, there has to be policy, kind of a policy response, an institutional response, which needs to be there, and there isn't much movement on that as yet. But, and some of us have written on that about how we can think about airshed at a regulatory level. We think there are enough regulatory hooks right now available for the government to move towards a regional level thinking. And that's something that hasn't happened, that needs to happen. I think one thing that really needs to change is our reliance on the courts. It has always been a court-led movement for clean air. As Lavanya said, the right to, there's so many rights that have been read in, and one of them is the right to clean air that's been read into the Article 21 kind of jurisprudence. But we cannot expect our courts to be handling this problem. Then that's when we come up with set up a smog tower in Lajpat Nagar and CP, and that will resolve a problem. That's the kind of solution we are going to come up with. Or fortunately, that order was then recalled, but go ahead and impose a penalty of 5,000 rupees on a farmer because he's the one who's affecting my right to clean air. Those are the kind of orders that you can then expect from the judiciary. What we can expect from the judiciary is to ensure there's no backsliding. If you've come up with a power plant related emission norm, make sure you do not keep shifting that date. That's where the judiciary needs to come in. And I know Aruna is smiling because, she's written everything on this and more. So that's where we need but on just kind of responding to your question, Aruna, I think air quality and climate change, I think we confuse them at our peril. I think actually the confusion happens, and it happens not to our benefit, but kind of either or situation. Oh, that we've come up with NCAP, so we've resolved climate change. No, it doesn't work like that. But unfortunately, the confusion, whether it's our policymakers, our legislators, our lawyers, or judges, the language is utterly confused. They will have global warming, greenhouse gas emission, Paris Agreement, sulfur dioxide, nitrous dioxide, and particulate matter in the same sentence and say we need to resolve all this. That's how we're treating this. And that's the unfortunate part of it. But I mean, I don't know, Navroz will have more to say about co-benefits, and I don't disagree with that. But it's just that the language sometimes gets so confused, and then the conversation really doesn't go anywhere. And I think there's a lot to be done on air quality, irrespective of the larger kind of issues on climate.
Navroz, would you like to add something to that?
Well, I think Shibani very passionately made the case for both greater clarity as well as as well as for the judiciary to play the roles that actually can play extremely well, and that perhaps it's backing away from, and in other areas perhaps less so. I would say that we are one of the things that's coming. So she sort of brought me into with this co-benefits language, which of course this idea that you can that a lot of developmental gains can also bring mitigation or adaptation benefits, and public transport is of course example number one. But I think the air pollution mitigation story, the science of it is really quite complicated. In fact, right now there's an active scientific debate about whether and how the fact that we've been relatively more effective in limiting aerosols is partly why we're seeing a spike in temperatures that go a little bit beyond what the climate models say. So the intersection is complicated, right? If you move from coal-fired power plants to renewable energy, it's going to give you both benefits, right? Air pollution and mitigation. If you do end of pipe stuff and you reduce particulates, it might actually end up making warming worse. So the co-benefits idea has never been an idea that's a blanket idea once and for all on all issues. There are trade-offs. It does depend on your solutions. It's a way of having a conversation. And I think it's been powerful in India, but with this significant caveat that this is not a blanket get out of jail free card by any means.
And that also leads into another important conversation, which is also, I think, from what Shibani raised, is what we're looking at, and all of the intense focus on heat and extreme heat in the international press, especially in these last couple of summers, where there's a lot of, again, Ministry for the Future focus. But also a lot of the focus is on the emissions costs of cooling India in times of runaway warming versus heating, which is taken as a given. But also for us living in Indian cities, sometimes feeling that they're increasingly unlivable without air conditioning. It's a luxury that's not afforded to millions. But what should our actual ministries be prioritizing when it comes to adapting to extreme heat, Radhika? And given that very few states have actual heat plans, money to back them up, and our builders, our urban planners, our governments even having conversations around efficient cooling as we build more in India, as we lock in more carbon, the choices that we're making, and how can that be something that is prioritized?
Yeah, thanks, Aruna. So you're right. There is sort of this increasing alarmism around heat, and there's some emerging conversation around how many countries have been living with heat for a long time. Why is this relevant? And I think that extreme heat is actually, it's very interesting because of the moment that we're in right now globally, right? So what's happening is that first of all, when we look at global energy discourses, for the most part, they're focused on heating, right? And on providing heating, because a lot of that is based on, where these studies come from, and, the climates that that the organizations and authors have been based in. And but when we look at the end of the century, what we see is that the global energy demand just from air conditioning is going to be much higher than that globally from heating, right? So actually, first, this is not only an India problem. This is a global problem, and we did this study recently, which was kind of it got a lot of attention, because what we found was that if you go from a global mean temperature of 1.5 to a global mean temperature of 2 degrees, the largest absolute change in cooling degree days, which is an indicator of extreme heat, is in tropical areas. But the largest relative change is going to be in countries that are all in Northern Europe. So UK, Ireland, Switzerland, Norway, these are the top 4 countries that see the largest relative increase in cooling degree days when you go from a 1.5 mean temperature, global temperature, to a 2 degree world. And so I think it's important to recognize that this is not just about focusing on India and what it's going to do to India. But actually, this is a global issue that a lot of places around the world are grappling with. Now, what are the implications of this? Just linking it back to our previous chat over here, energy is key to that. Because what happens when you have increased heat is your peak demand goes up for air conditioning, particularly if you can afford it. So last year in the UK, when the temperature went up above 40 degrees, the UK put on its coal-fired power plant. And that has huge implications, right? For a country like the UK, like Navroz was saying, is, sort of has been a champion in many ways for climate change and climate policies, to turn on a coal plant, which has huge implications and has huge startup costs and then winding down costs. It's problematic. Now what does this mean in India, right? So CPR did this wonderful study of looking across heat action plans in 37 different states that tell us that it's a growing way in which we're trying to adapt and think about how we respond to extreme heat. Right now, in terms of air conditioning, about less than 10% of the country has air conditioning, but in about 20 years, the electricity demand from space cooling is going to be 60 to 70%. So there's a huge increase, and heat, therefore, is not just an isolated issue. It's an issue that's linked with energy demand, with carbon emissions, with food security, with transportation, with human health, and actually sort of, achievement of development indicators across the board. I find it interesting that actually the words heat, cooling, refrigeration, thermal, none of them appear in any of the 17 SDGs or their 169 targets. And so it's really been a blind spot. It's been a blind spot in our sustainability debates. And suddenly we have to wake up to it because of the levels of extreme heat that we're seeing, not just in India, but around the world. Now, coming to your question about what can we do, right? I know we're short of time, so I'm going to be brief, but I will just say that there are measures that we can take that are cooling related, and then there is the kind of gift of air conditioning I think of, which is that it is electricity based, which means that if you decarbonize the grid, you can go very far. It's not straightforward to decarbonize the grid, but it's one of the key measures that we have. So the three things I would say that are important now, one is really thinking about how we embed passive cooling measures. And that, when I say that, I mean going back to what Navroz and I were talking about earlier, which is embedding infrastructure as a lever of change within the built environment. Within sort of, transportation systems, within buildings, within how cities are planned. And because we have so much construction going on still in India, because we're not locked into demand side patterns and construction patterns, there's a real opportunity to do this and do it right. The second is to really focus on energy efficiency. And I know energy efficiency sounds, it sounds boring. We've been saying it forever. I think it's also interesting that at least in the UK, over 30 years, energy efficiency has played the largest role in reducing emissions, much more than renewables and switching to gas. So energy efficiency is really key to this, and then focusing on F-gases, which of course we're in the transition towards already with the Kali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, but actually complying with that and even over complying, like we were talking about earlier in this conversation, can be really important.
And that is also tying us in, and we immediately directly have also a question waiting for us in the Q&A box to you, Radhika. You talked about the role of, this is from Neha Agarwal, you talked about the role that demand side interventions have played and their critical role. I'm curious about the extent to which national and subnational policies support these, and relatedly, do we see an adequate focus on ancillary infrastructure such as interoperable EV charging stations, for instance?
Yeah, so I would say the challenge with all of our sort of subnational policies and national policies also to some extent is that they remain siloed, right? When we think about cooling, we think about energy efficiency of air conditioners or minimum energy performance standards, or we think of building energy codes very separately. And it's the same issue as with climate change more broadly, right? Which is how do we actually embed these issues across ministries, across cross-cutting strategies, whether that is larger development goals or, sort of net zero plans and strategies, or climate adaptation plans, or mitigation plans. And I think that has been the challenge. So it's not that we don't have subnational action. We do have a lot of subnational action, and often, on cooling related issues, these are set at the national level, and then, states adopt what the center sets. And we have sort of minimum energy performance standards that are very, that are moving quickly. There's a real emphasis on ratcheting up and making sure that they comply with global best practice. But the thing that I think is missing is that sort of mainstreaming of these issues. And again, I would make it broader than cooling and say this is true of demand more broadly, right? We still are very much focused on this narrative of needing more supply driven by scarcity, whereas we're not really thinking about what we need that supply for, how can it be met, and therefore sort of how do we devise our demand side more in a sort of more organized manner to respond to that. So subnational actions and sort of state level, heat action plans, while they exist, often they are just kind of copies of each other without accounting for the local context, and without being embedded in larger strategies that are motivated towards development and addressing climate change more broadly.
If I might just jump in, Aruna, for a second, to complement something that Radhika said, I think there's what she points to is a general issue, right? Which is when we think about this in silos, you think about a little bit on the urban side, the transport side. So even within transport, we think about electric vehicles, public transport is a separate issue, urban design is a separate issue, freight is a separate issue. And we don't actually, we're still working with a governance structure that is designed to think of all these issues separately. And we have this phrase we throw around. It's a grand phrase. We like grand phrases, building a climate ready state. And the idea is that it's not like the state can solve all of this, but a lot of this requires the state to open up and enable much more coordination across all these issues. And interoperability is just sort of, a technical point that is an example of this, but it extends much more broadly. So questions about cropping choice and cropping patterns, and how that then ties to resilience against shifting weather patterns, right? That then ties to discussions about minimum support program. So suddenly you've got conversations that stretch across agriculture ministries, land use, water use, economic delivery mechanisms like minimum support program. All of these have to come together. And there are many, many examples of this, I think, when we are looking at climate change on both the mitigation side and the adaptation side. So we need to actually be thinking of structures that bring all of this together at the central level, but also between the central government and states, because many adaptation issues in particular are actually driven by the states. So there's a larger question about how do we reconstruct and rewire the state to better engage these questions and bring in stakeholders of all sorts in ways that allow them to do so.
I think is really interesting, and especially from last summer, where we said that we would feed the world, and then India's wheat crop was really hit by the heat, and a lot of people are asking, why didn't we think this through? And we should have known this. States should have been speaking to each other. There is so much intelligence also on this, but also the sort of conversations that are happening and the thinking through, which should be part of governance and part of institutions as we go towards our 2070 net zero, or thinking about this long-term low emissions development, but thinking it through together and not in silos and not from a scarcity sort of mindset where, we seem to be acting reactively. Another question that someone wanted to raise, I haven't mentioned, to Radhika as well as Lavanya and Shivani. If the development of resilience can be framed as a right against which litigation might be brought, is this avenue being actively pursued with respect, for instance, to the provision of cooling in homes, right? Cooling as a right and as a developmental right, and something that if you don't receive, could sue.
Lavanya? Oh, right. I have a non-homes, non-built environment example of this. So maybe I'll go first and then I'll turn it over to Lavanya, who'll be much more legal than my anecdote over here. But you know, in Switzerland, there's a case that's ongoing, and they have gone to court, and Lavanya might be familiar with this. And they're called climate grannies, and the elderly women who are basically fighting the state and have gone against the state to say that the state has not taken action against extreme heat, and it has really affected their health. And there are similar cases that are ongoing in Europe about people who have multiple sclerosis, because there's a real impact of extreme heat on multiple sclerosis. And so what we're seeing is a lot of communities are organizing themselves around the impact of extreme heat on health, and then litigating and going up to the state against that. Lavanya, you might have more to say about this or other aligned examples.
Thanks, Radhika. So it's actually a great case to bring up, the Klimaseniorinnen case, the climate grannies, Swiss grannies case. It was the first case to have actually gotten as far as it did in the European Court of Human Rights, and they held the first sort of grand chamber hearing on this case, the first climate change case before the European Court of Human Rights on 29th of March. And it's an interesting case, both for the sort of aspects that you outlined, but also because it actually fulfilled all the procedural requirements, you know, exhausted local remedies and all of that, sort of went through the Swiss national courts and then got to the European Court of Human Rights. So among the cases, climate cases that are in the European Court of Human Rights, it has the most prospects of success. And it's the first case that's actually going to be sort of, you know, the first judgment that's going to come out of it. There is another case, the Portuguese children's case, which is against 33 European countries. Again, it's young Portuguese sort of activists, children and young adults, who are actually arguing that that 33 countries, including Portugal, across Europe, are not doing enough, not doing their fair share on climate change. So actually part of what they relied on was work that I'd done in terms of evidence with a group of quantitative social science modelers on what a national fair share is for each state. So of course the Swiss government and others sort of challenged it because it was their job to challenge the evidence. But it's a sort of very interesting set of cases that is worth keeping an eye out for, I think, to see what kind of outcomes come from those. In terms of the sort of question on domestic litigation, I think I would sort of very much echo Shibani's line on this, is that we need to have a clear sense of what exactly we are expecting the courts to do here. I would not, like Shibani, I think, be sort of keen to have the courts go into the level of detail about whether they should extend rights to include sort of a right to cooling or a right to, you know, specifics of policies. I think what we have already, which is a very robust right to life, a right to a healthy environment, which has sort of extensive jurisprudential backing. I think it's a question of understanding that the existing rights actually being impacted by climate harms, and what it is that the existing rights require states to do. So it is for courts to actually say that the state needs to have a plan. It needs to have a plan that is tailored to the science, that is credible, that's implementable, and that, you know, to echo Shibani again, that, you know, once they have that plan in place, that they're not going to backslide from it. It's about making sure they have a plan, not actually specifying what that plan should be, because they don't have the competence to do that. They shouldn't, you know, get into those details. I think they need to make sure that the state has a plan which is credible, implementable, and will actually deliver on that plan in relation to benchmarking of the rights that already exist. Thanks.
Also going to think through elections happening in extreme heat season next year and how many people are going to be exposed. So moving on to a couple of questions that Avantika Goswami from CSC has dropped in the chat. Navroz, what do you think of the mainstream emphasis on private investment in decarbonization? Current trends are pointing to limited private finance mobilization, whether that's by MDBs or by bilateral climate finance, particularly in emerging economies. But all solutions today point towards the private sector, trillions that must be brought in. She's also got another question, which is, we see not only historical features yeah, do you want to get that first? We'll come back.
Yeah, perhaps,
Yeah.
perhaps, and maybe we can take the broaden it out to the others. I'm assuming Avantika met that current trends point to limited public finance mobilization rather than private, because she talks about MDVs or bilateral climate finance. You know, I mean, I think this is the new mantra, right? The billions to trillions sort of story, and I just think that we are in a situation where we're realizing that all the solutions, certainly on the mitigation side, and some of them perhaps to not to the same degree on the adaptation side, and definitely also in terms of loss and damage, do require mobilizing a lot more capital. Many of these are capital intensive transitions, and there certainly isn't the public money to be had, because taxpayers in the North are saying, well, you know, maybe even if in principle we accept some degree of historical responsibility, when the time comes, we're not willing to cough up. I mean, the US is simply not able to, in its structure, pass the necessary, get the necessary votes in its in the Senate Appropriations Committee and so on and so forth. Is it, you know, where does that really leave us? And that's where this kind of push to try and harness private investment is really coming from. I think there's been a lot of contorted efforts to make this happen, including a burgeoning offset market. And CSC has a very nice report out recently about this. There's been a slew of reports about dodgy offsets. The US is trying something called the Energy Transition Accelerator, which again is a very complex mechanism to try and induce private capital to flow to the South. You know, at the end of the day, it looks like these transformations will happen when countries, particularly in countries like India, see a way forward to their own interests being met by moving in a low carbon direction. Multilateral development banks, bilateral finance, these could help in leveraging and bringing down the cost of capital. And this is kind of a big issue. The cost of capital in the developing world is much higher than it is in the developed world, and that's a massive obstacle. But more generally, the question is, can developing country states reorganize themselves to become agents of this kind of transformation, like the East Asian states did in bringing around development in the 1970s? Can we build these kinds of green developmental states? It's a very big ask. It's a longer conversation than today, but I think that's the kind of question we have to be asking for the scale of transformation that we see today.
Amazing. Thanks, Navroz. One question for Lavanya before she also leaves, if you have time to squeeze that in, is a question from Harman. Do you think adding more teeth to international climate negotiations architecture risks undermining cooperation in the first place? Could it push states to adopt more protectionist or insular approaches as opposed to more cooperative approaches? For instance, Kyoto failed to take off since it was much too quickly, while Paris has arguably succeeded owing to its voluntary commitment nature.
Thanks, Arnand. Thanks to Herman for that question. I don't think I suggested that the international climate change negotiations or the Paris Agreement could be strengthened or, have more teeth added to it, because I think if there were efforts to do that, it would certainly undercut the autonomy and the balance between autonomy and sovereignty, autonomy, and international regulation that parties sought to strike in that very carefully negotiated, balanced agreement. So it is not so much that the teeth can be added to that agreement, it's that the wider architecture of international law can bolster and strengthen the UN climate change regime. And I think within the climate change regime itself, only tweaks are possible, really precisely because of this sort of delicate balance that's been struck by states. But there is much more than the UN climate change regime. And that's, I think, the point that I was trying to make, much more so than just the climate regime. Thanks.
Thanks, Lavanya. Okay, and we've got one question to end on, and I think everyone can sort of chime in. This one is from Ankit Bhardwaj, who says, hello, old friends. There's a lot of amazing collective expertise in this room in shaping India's climate policy. And at the risk of going meta, what lessons have you taken from this past decade of shaping the conversation, and what advice do you have for others for forging a democratic and just response to climate change in this crucial decade? Great question. And who wants to take turns?
Can I just jump in quickly, because I have to leave a few minutes for the end, but it is going to be very quick. I think to me, the biggest lesson has been that we need to have ownership, that there needs to be ownership of the solutions, and that ownership will come from inclusiveness and participation, whether it's in the conversations that we have, conversations like this, or in terms of involving stakeholders in decision making. I think we need ownership to have just response to climate change, and we need a sense of fairness there. And I think the other sort of element I would highlight is that expertise and knowledge are crucial, and they empower. And I think we are reluctant sometimes to acknowledge expertise. We tend to move towards more populist and popular solutions, and I think we need to recognize that expertise empowers us and will enable us to take better decisions and more informed decisions, and have more ownership of the decisions that we actually take, so that they're implemented and implementable. That's where I'd like to leave it. Thank you, Ankit. Lovely to see you virtually.
Thanks so much, Lavanya. Anybody wants to take a stab?
I was hoping to come in at the end, but if my colleagues are going to be reticent, I'll jump in.
No, that's fine. I can say a few things because, I mean, my work has been only partly climate, but other environmental concerns domestically. But just in terms of the work we've done as part of CPR over the decade, I think a few things that I've learned is that things move incrementally, but they can also just change overnight. So it's just these conversations, just conversations among stakeholders, among researchers, academics. I think we just have to keep them going, have solutions, long-term, short-term, medium-term kind of ready. And also, I think what, as part of our work, we've tried to do and we continue to do is that we often end up missing the nuts and the bolts of how institutions work, because at the end of the day, a lot of what we're talking about comes down to implementation, and we often miss out on institutional capacities, institutional abilities to do a lot of things, whether it's in terms of expertise that Lavanya spoke about, but also just human resource constraints, financial constraints. I think a lot of those things have to be considered when we are making our policies. Often we make, for instance, in the air quality space, you come up with a policy kind of being entirely blind to our inability to implement most of it. It just speaks for poor policy making. And also just improving accountability. I think that's something that would speak to making it more robust, but also making it more inclusive. Just from the legal aspect, accountability has just been so poor. In fact, we failed. One of the main reasons why environmental governance has failed is because there is no accountability, whether for the polluters or for absence of governance. So I think a lot of these things have not entered the policy space. And I think if many of us from different kind of angles come to this and talk about this, write about this, not just in terms of short responses, quick responses, but how these things kind of pan out in the medium to long term, I think is important. I think a lot of the work that Lavanya and Navroz and Radhika in terms of co-benefits is now, we see it. But this is something they've been, speaking about for so long, and it's so nice to see all that in kind of direct and indirect ways kind of informing our policy. So it just takes time, but it could just happen that we have a climate law tomorrow. We don't know. We could have an ordinance. President could be signing it any time. And then we'll all just be holding on to a new climate law that we have to implement very soon. Over to you, Radhika or Navroz.
I'll go next. Thanks, Shubhani. So I want to build on both what Lavanya and Shivani have said, that, I think it really lies in acknowledging and deepening the interrelatedness of these issues. So in so many ways, what we're dealing with here are complex socio-technical and institutional challenges, and with and climate change, it is this wicked problem which sort of sits on top of everything, exacerbates many existing inequalities. And it's only in sort of thinking through the interrelatedness of, like, even the sort of things we've talked about in this discussion today, whether it's energy, climate change, air pollution, extreme heat and cooling, all of these are tied with each other. Like sometimes you want to put the air conditioning on just to keep the pollution out, right? And so it's sort of, thinking in that kind of manner that makes space for not just the silo that you're working within, which needs a lot of deepening, but also understanding the larger context within that piece of work and that issue and that problem exists. I think is really important to being able to make that kind of transition that that Ankit is talking about in his question.
Thanks so much for that, Radhika. I'm going to hold on and say, because we are actually on time, we still have another time for another 6 minutes of questions, or whether you'd like to come around to the finale.
Well, I would love to take my stab at Ankit's question, but maybe we can come back to that if there are other questions to take, and then I'll answer it maybe towards the end, or take my stab at it towards the end.
Right. Okay. So, Navroz, you mentioned the importance or possibility of green developmental states emerging from the majority world. How do you or other panelists see the possibility of post-development thinking and practices in the majority world for the provision of decent living? So, essentially, alternatives to developmentalism as opposed to development alternatives.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we probably all have to put our collective heads together for this one. I think there's a little bit of a hint as to at least how I think about this came in earlier in the conversation when I was talking about the fact that it's not just a green economy we want to build; it's a green and just economy, right? And in the process, and another little hint actually comes from Radhika's observations about the importance of the demand side, right? And the demand side obviously also shapes the kind of lived experience people have. What is the quality of urban spaces? Is it not just more convenient and green, but is it also just add to the quality of life? And I think that these kinds of strands come together if we can think about the climate crisis as a way of re-envisioning what it is we want to get out of development. What does this development experience actually look like? Of course, it's a much bigger question. It's also a crisis, and we don't want to sort of pause and spend all of our time on philosophical discussion. We actually kind of have to get on with it. So there's this whole urgency side of the story. But I think that given that relatively blunt policy instruments like carbon pricing and so on and so forth haven't quite got us there, we need to find ways of harnessing much more what Elna Ostrom called this kind of polycentric energy, this bottom-up energy where communities are envisioning the sorts of futures they want to have and thinking about how they can align them with a low carbon story. CC, the way this was talked about was the idea of shifting pathways towards sustainability, with the idea being that, especially in the developing world where we haven't locked into infrastructures, re-envisioning cities in a way that makes for a better urban experience is in fact shifting your development pathway entirely. It's not just an ameliorative, it's not just a band-aid, it's just not EV adoption. It's actually rethinking what the urban experience is like. And I think if we can sort of give ourselves the flexibility to think in those more expansive ways, then it actually might also end up being much more transformative. It also comes back to the question of institutions. We can't do that kind of thinking unless the spaces are opened up within which to do that sort of thinking, right? But whether at the urban scale, at the state level, or at the national level. So there is a sort of a way of looking at things that sees the climate challenge or the crisis as an opening to have a more fundamental conversation. I think few countries are doing it. I would love to see more of it, but there is this little glimmer in there that would be worth kind of exploring and thinking about a bit more.
Brilliant. And I think we are close to time. Of course, there is another there are so many questions in the chat box, and that should we do we want to go over time? Do we want to keep it snappy? Or Navroz, do you want to come back to Ankit's question? And
Yeah.
what
But sorry for taking the floor again, but yeah, I'd love to come back to Ankit's question. Ankit was somebody who worked with us for many years and is now a PhD student at NYU doing stellar stuff. So I think the reason and this wasn't a planted question, incidentally, it was organic. The reason I really want to come back to it is because, this is the 50th anniversary kind of event, and we have been at this in some way, shape, or form, in some combination of all of us, for pretty much getting on to 14 years. And really, the lesson that I would take away is some of the initial impetus, in a sense, has paid off. And the initial impetus was really this, that thinking about this set of problems within the context that we all sit in leads to new insights. Radhika talked about how much more work there was on heating than on cooling. Well, that's because a lot of the research funding comes out of European and American contexts, where heating is much more of a story. A lot of the modeling is about glide paths to net zero, when many countries haven't even peaked yet. And so the construct of avoided emissions, and how do you avoid emissions, which is actually going to drive policy conversation in the developing world, that's actually been a struggle to get into policy conversation. So much of the policy design story has been around cap and trade and carbon pricing and so on and so forth. Well, price mechanisms, and there was a question on this, don't work that well in India because the price signals don't get transmitted up and down the chain. And we might have to probably put together much more messy policy mixes and policy packages that both do technology push, demand pull, social safety nets, all of this kind of combined in a messy sort of policy context. So sitting in the global south, trying to think through these conversations, I think at a place like CPR, we've been able to kind of open the door and sort of engage a lot of young people over the years, folks like Ankit. And I think that's really the lesson I take away, is that being really attentive to context rather than looking at sort of one-size-fits-all solutions, and unleashing, in particular, a lot of young people to think about the context within which they work and come up with those creative ideas. That really pays off. And that's the basis on which, when we think about transformative pathways, it will be countries like India saying, this is the future we envision. We want to have a conversation about financing based on that vision, not on some vision that is being foisted upon us, right? It is kind of an Atmanirbhar way of looking at things. And you need to have homegrown think tanks and homegrown institutions that take seriously these questions. And that's really what's kind of got us exercised and animated over the last 12 to 14 years. And, it's been a great ride. So thank you. And thanks very much to the audience for being part of all of this.
Thank you so much, Navroz. This has been an incredible and truly interdisciplinary conversation. I feel 200x smarter at the end of it. But it's really, really clear that we need the expertise of CPR. We need the space to have this sort of imagining, to be able to ask these sort of questions, and to really think about, what a just future for India and what a truly democratic response to climate change is going to be in this critical and crucial decade. So thank you so much, Radhika, Shibani, Lavanya, Navroz, also to Sonali and others, the back end, for putting this together. We're sadly going to have to come to a close, but I hope we can do a lot more of these in the future. And for those whose questions we couldn't bring up, please send them over. And I think one of the best things about being a journalist who also dashes off emails to each of the speakers and ask them to give inputs. They've always been super open to sharing, and really open to researchers as well as journalists and anyone, and to try and make this element accessible so that climate change isn't, or environmental law, or air pollution, or any of this is something that's easily translatable, and it's something that matters to millions. And I think that's something that, why we need CPR, and that's exactly what came through in today's conversation. Yeah.
Thank you, Aruna.
Thank
Thanks a lot.